Sitting incredibly close to the English-Scottish border and overlooking the River Tweed is a colossal and forgotten castle that is one of the most spectacular that I've ever seen. Norham Castle saw lots of action during the conflicts between the English and the Scots, and today it stands as a beautiful and huge ruin. It's a fine sight to see in the border country, and it's a huge structure. The keep would have been a huge and impenetrable fortress, but its commanding position would have been a key defensive element for protecting the border. In this video we're going to delve into the history of Norham Castle, and also show you around. So join us today as we look at the forgotten medieval border castle, Norham Castle, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Norham Castle is found right next to the River Tweed on the border of England and Scotland, and was founded by Ranulph Flambard, the Bishop of Durham. Flambard himself is known in history as a key advisor to William Rufus, also known as William II, the son of William the Conqueror. He is also remembered for being the first man who was able to escape the Tower of London after he was imprisoned there by Henry I. The Bishop of Durham had given orders for the castle to be constructed in 1121 because he felt he needed to protect his land in his area of Durham, which he was overseeing. In particular, he felt that this needed protecting from the Scots, who were causing some problems around the border. It was the Scots who would cause most of the problems at Norham as time went on. This area and region could be considered at the time to have been lawless and rather wild, and there was also lots of conflict in the border counties. The castle would have been garrisoned in times of war and would have linked up with the castles nearby, such as at Berwick. David I of Scotland in 1136 invaded Northumberland and captured the castle at Norhen rather easily. After this it was then handed back to the Bishop of Durham, but was later captured again after another invasion by the Scots. The castle was damaged rather a lot after these attacks and occupations, and after this, Hugh de Puiset, the Bishop of Durham, decided to order the rebuild of the fortification, and it was here where Norham Castle expanded on a large scale. He went to town expanding to a huge extent, with the creation of the Great Tower or the Keep, which was originally on the site of a two-storey hall. This huge tower was a statement piece of Norham Castle, and the different rooms in here would have been of great opulence. The keep was intended to have been intimidating for anyone who was thinking of attacking. Later Hugh would support rebels in a revolt against King Henry II, and at this time William the Lion, the Scottish king, invaded Northumberland. The rebels were defeated and Bishop Hugh was forced to give up his castle to the king, and the crown then took control of Norham, with a constable being placed in charge and a garrison of soldiers loyal to the king being installed at the fortification. Over the next few years it would be passed between the Bishop of Durham and the crown. In the early 13th century it played host to King John and William the Lion, who met and stayed at Norham Castle. John would spend large amounts of money on the castle himself to protect his realm. He kept building up the castle's defences and reinforced the garrison that was there. In 1215 Alexander II of Scotland invaded and besieged Norham Castle for 40 days. Throughout this time the castle managed to hold out, and the Scottish could not take Norham. Edward I, whose nickname was the Hammer of the Scots, also spent a large amount of time at the castle. He and his advisors arbitrated between 13 contenders to the Scottish throne, known as the Great Cause, and he stayed at Norham during this time. When he invaded Scotland himself in 1293, his queen stayed at Norham, whilst the king carried out his campaign, and this shows you how strong a fortress the castle was. The invasions by the Scots continued throughout the 14th century, but sometimes they decided to leave Norham. Robert the Bruce though besieged Norham for nearly a year, showing how long the castle could hold out for. The Scots even managed to get inside the outer bailey of the castle for 3 days before the garrison forced them out again. This lengthy siege did not succeed, but even later the Scots would try again, failing to take the castle in another siege in 1319 that lasted 7 months. The sieges continued and the Scots did capture Norham in 1327, but it was quickly passed back to the Bishop of Durham yet again after peace was agreed. During the Wars of the Roses, the castle even saw some action between the Lancastrians and Yorkists. It was held by Yorkist for Edward IV in 1462, but the Lancastrians later besieged the castle for 18 days before the castle was relieved by the Yorkists. It did switch allegiances, but a need to reinforce the defences came once more. In 1497, Norham Castle was besieged yet again for 2 weeks by James IV of Scotland with his army. They used technology such as artillery to try and breach the walls, and the walls were smashed by the artillery, but the garrison were eventually relieved by the English army. It's clear that throughout the medieval period, Norhen was excellent at withstanding sieges and doing a defensive job. James IV would try to invade England again using artillery, crossing the border in 1513 and heading towards Norham. His guns would smash the outer defences for days before they made their way inside the outer bailey, and this time the castle was forced to surrender. The outer wall had been almost destroyed, but a few weeks later at the Battle of Flodden Field, James IV was killed nearby, and the castle returned to the English. Cardinal Wolsey, one of Henry VIII's closest advisors, later inspected Norham, saying it was well fortified with murderers, and he noted how strong the walls were. Bishop Thomas Ruefall of Durham then also began to restore the castle and repair the damage during the early 1500s, and new orders for earthwork defences were made, with repairs also being done. The castle became transformed into a powerful artillery fortress. The engineers made changes so that the garrison could return fire from covered positions with artillery. This included rebuilding the outer wall and making sure that the walls could absorb incoming shots, but also constructing other gun towers and positions. Norham Castle was kept in a good state of repair, with a strong garrison being based at the time. As peace was established between the English and the Scots, the garrison over time was reduced, and by the end of the 1500s, the castle had already fallen into decay and disrepair. Queen Elizabeth I even said to the captain of the castle that she would not spend a penny on restoring Norham, and from this the castle then fell into ruin. What we will now do is show you around the different parts of the castle. One of the most prominent features of Norham Castle as you visit is the curtain walls and the gatehouse. It was a strategically important location that sits next to the River Tweed. We've established that the castle was besieged a number of times, and the walls were very strong over time. These curtain walls managed to keep out invaders and attackers well, thanks to their size and thickness. One key weakness to the castle though is always a gatehouse. This gatehouse would have been the main entrance to the fortification. The archway just about survives today, and it would have been much taller. This was the west gate, and from where most people would have entered and approached the castle. It would have been a 2-storey gatehouse with a portcullis and wooden gates, but also a drawbridge which could have been brought up to isolate Norham in the first instance if attackers were nearby. This would have meant that attackers would have to cross the outer ditch, and guards from the gatehouse could have defended well against these. The outer bailey is a prominent part of Norham Castle. Inside this area you can see various other buildings. It served as the first part of the castle that attackers could enter once they've stormed the walls. Today it's a peaceful part of the fortification and is very green, containing ruins of many other buildings. Inside here soldiers were housed, and a busy community lived here that helped to run the castle and provide services for those living here. A brewhouse can be found in this area that brewed beer for the soldiers, and for this a circular kiln would have been used. During the latter 1400s, water was brought into the castle for domestic use using an aqueduct in the Moat from a nearby spring. This fed a shallow square with steps down that allowed the castle's inhabitants to fill up buckets. Water was also needed in the brewhouse, which is found next to the Moat. Water could also have been used to do other activities, but because of this supply, it allowed guards to withstand sieges for a very long time. Inside the outer bailey are a set of artillery positions. These artillery emplacements overlook the River Tweed and could have been used to fight off invaders. Inside here artillery cannons and guns would have been found and attached to the emplacements. There would have been guards based here who would have been tasked with firing the guns should they have been needed. At Portland Castle in Dorset, during the reign of Henry VIII, it was common for guards to sleep by their guns in case an invasion was on the horizon. The 3 arched openings were built in response to the sieges that took place. Although they are quite low, these guns here wouldn't have been cannons as we know them, but more rudimentary forms of artillery. So these emplacements were a key part of the castle's defences, especially playing a key role in defending Norham against attackers. Found in the outer ward or bailey is also the remains of a small chapel building. What is strange about this is that the chapel is found very close to the artillery positions. This is where the custodian of the castle or the soldiers would have visited for religious ceremonies, and a priest would have been based here. Today you walk in the undercroft of the chapel, and this building would have been rather large. But you can't help but think that putting this close to the artillery positions wouldn't have been ideal, due to the fact that the area would attract lots of fire and fighting. To access the inner ward and the heart of the castle, you would have had to walk across the Drawbridge. Today it's a permanent wooden bridge, but this would have been a bridge that could have been lowered or brought up if the attackers had managed to storm the outer bailey. This bridge, in conjunction with the moat and the ditches, helped to keep people outside this area of the castle. Next to this would have been towers, which would have been used by guards to take down attackers or fire from. There would have possibly been an archway at the end of the drawbridge, which could have been secured by another gateway, keeping the inner bailey secure. A barbican would also have been found here, protecting the bridge, this being a fortified outpost, but as time went on and siege tactics and artillery progressed, barbicans became less significant. The inner bailey really is the heart of every castle. Inside here there would have been a number of different buildings of Norham Castle, and this would have been the most exclusive part of the fortification. Entry to the inner bailey would have been guarded by soldiers, and only those with permission would have been allowed inside here. Whilst within here, you would have had to pass through the Gatehouse, and you can see the remains of a number of different buildings. You can see the kitchens, a huge chamber block, and also the Great Hall. The kitchens would have been a very busy place inside the castle, and there would have been a number of staff inside here who would have worked hard to serve the custodian. We know that there are accounts of very high profile guests staying at Norham. For example, kings of England and Scotland made their way inside the castle's walls. So for this there would have been great feasts and banquets held here. This would have meant that huge preparations would have been needed to be carried out for these great events to have happened. Fish would probably have been gathered from the nearby River Tweed and then prepared in the kitchens. Kitchens were sometimes kept separate from the great towers in medieval castles to reduce the threat of fire should something go wrong. If a fire broke out, then it could be isolated and kept well away from the grandeur of the great tower or the keep. The Great Hall was where the banquets and the entertainment that was mentioned earlier would be held in. The Great Hall was the centre of the festivities for those at Norham, and it would be a place where vast decoration would be on offer. It was where dances would occur in the evenings, and where immense decoration would line the walls. The Great Hall may have even had windows that opened up onto the beautiful scenery of the River Tweed behind the castle. This would have been picturesque and impressive. The Bishop of Durham or other important figures would have sat at the high end of the hall and watched over the festivities which were going on. At the bottom end of the hall would have been links to the service rooms such as a pantry or buttery that went directly into the kitchens. The Great Chamber or the Chamber Block was the private suites and apartments which were used by the bishops and his household or even guests. Inside this area you'd get many different people living, sleeping and enjoying life here. The chamber block was where people could retire to for more private conversations or matters with the bishop, and it was a more exclusive area of the castle. There are many different rooms and areas inside the chamber that would have served different purposes. You can see many different openings for windows where the view of the surrounding scenery would have been enjoyed from. The Great Tower or the Keep of Norham Castle is the most prominent part of the fortification you see when you enter the area. Its building took place over a number of different phases, with different modifications being made to the Great Tower. It's a huge and colossal castle, which during the 15th century was built to include a fourth storey. As time went on, its function changed as it had been divided up into 4 floors, with each floor having private accommodation for important guests. You can see some arched openings that show the Norman architecture, but you can also see the pointed arches which show the different stages of the building, with these being 15th century. You can also see where the ceiling posts were put in, and also how many different fireplaces were built into the walls. A final siege in 1513 caused much damage to the Great Tower after bombardment by artillery. The first stage of building saw Ranulph Flambard construct a 2-storey hall that was about half the size of the tower. The vaulted lower floor that today forms the basements was used for storage, but on the upper floor was a grand ceremonial hall. Later the tower was doubled in width, with the fourth storey being added, with a hall, great chamber and private chamber also being used. But around 1422 the building was changed as a rectangular tower with many floors, and it was a peak of medieval architecture and design. A spiral staircase provided access to all the floors, and it would have been a huge structure where the bishop would have stayed. Also, the roof of the tower is flat. This could have possibly been where guards were stationed to keep an eye out for any invading forces. What strikes you when looking at the keep though is the sheer size of the castle, with there being a huge amount of windows and entrances. Today the north face of the Great Tower has collapsed due to the fact that it was this wall that faced the majority of the artillery bombardment of 1513. Even though it was rebuilt after this, the work wasn't as good as previously had been carried out. One of the most significant improvements to the defences at Norham Castle was the construction of Clapham's Tower. This would have been a tower in which guards would have been based that would have allowed fighting from the inner court to happen upon attackers who had breached to the outer court. So if attackers were inside the walls of the castle but were yet to breach the inner court, attacks could be launched against these from inside the inner part of the castle. This tower sits on the edge of the moat and would have been another key defensive structure. This tower has a pointed front and also space for artillery to be fired from. The border region between England and Scotland was known throughout the medieval period to have been an extremely dangerous and lawless area. However, Norham Castle stood the test of time and also showed itself to be an incredibly strong and powerful fortress in the midst of the danger. Throughout history it was besieged a number of times and stood tall more times than it fell, but today it's a castle which isn't very well known. There are some incredible places to visit across the world, and sometimes you stumble across a gem. Norham Castle is that diamond which stands tall above the English and Scottish border, presiding over the area and dominating the local skyline. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.